Imagine you becoming the strongest hero using a spear and ends up being feared and betrayed by his best friend and guys. Let's go. So I hope you like it and don't forget to subscribe so we can reach 100,000 subscribers and get this sign and start posting every 2 days. So let's get to the content. And after the conflict, Shin goes to Muku and starts crying for having his face disfigured. He asks him to bring Joshua to him because the boy doesn't just want him to be beaten, but when he sees the request, so complicated, Osi at first tries to deny it, but the boy kicks him and says it doesn't make sense. His servant can barely fight a 10-year-old boy. So Shun states that Muko will suffer a severe punishment when he returns to his family, and hearing this, servant decides to comply with the orders from his count, and Shun tells him to return to his family's house and gather as much information as possible about the Frederick house because that way they can find out who his parents, brothers, and even the boy's servants are, and so Shin decides to behead him in front of Frederick. But hearing such nonsense, Muko states that there is no justification for them to act like this, but for Shun, he does not need to justify his actions. After all, he is the successor of the Marquis of Casavilas and was brutally disrespected. Therefore, the boy states that this is enough justification for him to do whatever you want with Frederick, including killing his family. However, Muko explains to his count that no one would believe this story as it would be impossible for a 10-year-old boy to be able to do all that. Furthermore, even if they believed in their story, the dignity and prestige of the Vilas house would plummet, making everyone look at the Vilas house in a bad light, and upon hearing him wanting to dictate what should be done, Shin orders them to remain silent because he is the only one who gives orders there, but Muko continues to impose himself. After all, that is a very important matter to be treated in this way. Leviana then explains to them that the honor of her family is sometimes more important than their lives. In this sense, Shun becomes even more furious when she sees that receiving a lesson on his own family, and even with the boy's sheet, the servant continues with his explanation and states that if this story reaches the ears of the Marquis of the Vilas house, they will not end up with just a light punishment, but Shun says that they can simply erase the evidence of his crimes when he finishes them. So he questions whether Muko would be afraid to carry out this plan, and the servant says that they are at a disadvantage anyway. After all, the boy Frederick took the Vilas family insignia, and hearing this, Shun checks his ring of dawn and notices that he in fact no longer has his finger on this, but what the boy had told him about in this case is that Frederick had to return the boy's badge back, but for that Shun must go and see him alone, and beyond this, Muko problem notes that the fact that someone stole their family's insignia is already a huge attack on the family's reputation. So Muko states that they can't have this troubled boy as an enemy, and he tries to explain the situation to Shun and says that at the moment, he just have to lose by entering a conflict with Frederick, so the servant suggests that Shun suppress his anger and just observe the situation for now. I heard this, the boy gets angry because he thinks his servant wants him to apologize to Frederick, but Muko has the idea of sending the replacement to meet with Frederick. In the meantime, he asks Joshua if he really thinks that Shun will get the ring, and the boy says that he won't go in person, in which case he will send a trusted substitute so that person won't leak the information that the insignia of the Vilas family was robbed. I think about who the rise of Tuto could be. Kane arrives at Probolin, Shun's puppet. He notices that the whole situation was coldly calculated by Joshua, so he is impressed by this because he thought the boy was acting only out of emotion at that moment, and with Kane believes that Joshua could be a much greater person than he expected in the future. And in the middle of the conversation, this Iseline goes to them and thanks him for helping her, but he says he has no reason to be grateful after all. He was just helping her willingly, but Iseline remains firm in her gratitude because if it weren't for Joshua, her entire family would be in a problematic situation. So she thanks him once again. Miso girl, strange the way she acts nowadays. After all, she will be a great sorceress on the continent of the future, and who, by the way, is a cold killer who doesn't shed tears for anything. So he remembers a few more things about her and describes her as a tall, slender ice flower, and although she was cold, and Severa remained exhaling her beauty. And about her name, Iseline Joshua, she says that this is a name that matches her personality very well, and the girl talks again about this incident with Shun and says that she will help him if Joshua gets into trouble because of, after all, if they testify in favor of the boy, even the Imperial family will validate him. But Joshua says that she doesn't need to worry about that, but he asks her to do him a favor in the future, and she is readily willing to do anything. And before they proceed in the conversation, the protagonist simply notices someone snooping on him. When he sees that he has been discovered, the spy is impressed. After all, his sporting skills are exceptional and could not be discovered even by a master. He deduces that Joshua's skills are in fact good too, and this confirms the information that the spy received. Therefore, he decides to change his plan from now on, and after thinking about it a little, the spy had deduced that Joshua would just deceive him using the information about the lunar door, and if he really knows the location of this item, the spy is in doubt about what his master's judgment will be. In the meantime, Horblum goes to Joshua's restaurant. He is supposedly there, and upon noticing the count taking his daughter there, he confirms that the boy is in fact there, meets with Joshua, and asks on Shun's behalf that the boy return the dawn ring, as this is a very valuable item for the Vilas family. But Joshua remembers that Shang should go get it alone, so he asks the boy to give him another alternative. After all, his master is resting now and won't be able to find him there. Joshua asks Probalum to bring the knight so they can talk again, but in addition, he also asks Probalum for a favor in case the boy simply comes to Rio with him and wants the rings, dear ones he has on his fingers. They both leave and Kane wonders how his master manages to steal those jewels with that landscape expression. Joshua states that he just made a healthy exchange with Probalum because he gave him a chance to resolve things, so Joshua deserves to get something in return. But Kane continues without understanding anything and asks why the boy chose to keep the rings for the balloon. Joshua takes one of the rings and explains that he is from the Orb's house, whose sea name is an elven tear, in which he explains that the elves were a very mysterious race for humans, and because of this humans began to hunt them, causing many elves to lose their lands, which consequently led to their death, and after all this the elves came to hate humans, and to protect themselves they gathered in a forest in the extreme south of the continent, which ended up being later called the Forest of the Elves, and in order not to be found by humans once again the strongest elves joined their forces to create a barrier in the forest. However, even for the high elves this task was difficult because in the process many of them died when trying to build the barrier, but a certain elf survived in this. Humans started to believe that he would be a type of elf king, and then they called him Hobus, and after hundreds of years the only one who knew the location of the elven Fasta was an old friend of Hobus, in this case the last head of the Orb's family. However, this guy disappeared years ago, along with the destruction of his home. However, Joshua deduces that he was killed by someone who was looking for information about the elf forest. After all, the location of the elf forest is not known to the world, and the fact that no one knows about it to this day is because the head of the Orb's family does not leak information about this. Hobus would have known everything that happened when he met Orb's daughter. He made her a servant of the nobles and apologized for everything that happened to her father, and when crying, his tears fell on the girl's ring, transforming it into the elven tear ring, and after some time the daughter of Orbs ended up being and dying in this ring, became the target of a rumor that talked about it having hidden powers, and returning to the present Kane notices his master very thoughtful, so he asks Joshua, enter the place ahead, but first the boy asks Kane to provide him with some subordinates to defend his rear. Furthermore, he will soon go to the academy, so Joshua advises Kane to get out of there and go to where Duck is. He understands what his master means in this case. Joshua wants him to become a knight escorting Lucia, so Kane states that if they do that Joshua will already be in trouble, as he will be a noble without an escort. Furthermore, that house where he will stay is in an unknown location, in that Kane states that he needs to be on Joshua's side to prevent him from any problems, and what's more, he explains that Shun will also go to the academy, so Joshua will be in even more danger, but the boy claims that he will live discreetly. That being said, he asks Kane to learn fencing with Lord Agnos for him. In this, the knight notices his master bows and asks him to raise his head. After all, he doesn't want to see his master bowing to anyone, and that also includes him, so he accepts Joshua's request, but in return Kane asks so that the boy continues to be his master forever because he doesn't want to lower his head to anyone else. Joshua swears by his name that he will not abandon Kane, and for this brief dialogue we are explained about a tower called the Magic Tower, and it serves as a sanctuary. In addition to being a source of pride for sorcerers, the master of the tower notices that the seat of the red flames, the seat of thunder, and the void are unoccupied, so he asks why these seats are empty, and Marcos, the seat of the earth, explains that the red flames and void, they don't like to stay in the same environment, and already the thunder he left to resolve some private matters, and upon hearing this Ian gets furious, but decides to continue without them, so he informs them that the main topic of that conversation is the primordial stone, but before they start Theta interrupts them, showing no respect for the master. Ian says he's surprised to see him because he doesn't usually show up there, so the storm asks if the magma was actually stolen, and Marcos says that in addition to the magma, the Bronto also disappeared. He explains that no one knows what these two items are, so someone must have taken them by mistake, but still she states that if that is not the case they will be in serious trouble with this. Y says he has a good idea of who took the magma, but as for Bronto, he has no clue as to suspects, but Marcos states that near the area where Bronto appeared, there was an appearance of a magical swordsman, and upon hearing this, Alicia deduces who this person is, but Marcos explains that this time the swordsman is a 9-year-old child. Years then Ian remembers that the thunder went to the Avalon Empire, which by the way is the same place where Bronto was found, and taking this into consideration he asks Marcos to keep an eye on who took the magma, because if this information is true, there is nothing else they can to do this. Alicia once again suspects that this swordsman is the successor of such a person, so Marcos says that there is no relationship between these two people, because the protagonist of the rumors is the son of Agnos, and seeing him arguing more seriously, Ian tells them to calm down. It is observe the situation. After all, they are still not sure of anything, so he orders all the seats to leave. Meanwhile, Joshua begins speaking the language of runes, leaving him confused. After all, only high-ranking magicians know this language, and then he falls into deduces that Joshua could really be a magical swordsman, and when the boy finishes the magic he goes to Joshua to check on him and ask from which is the superior. He gained the blessing to know the runic language. In this, Josa explains that the high-level barrier of the 7th class automatically protects the user in danger, and in addition, it also increases his connections with the spiritual arts, but Joshua doesn't know much about other skills he has in this case. Kame soon grows the eye and asks him for the elven tear ring, but Joshua explains that this ring was made by a high elf who in turn dedicated it only to his daughter of the Orb's house, therefore men cannot use them, and so the boy states that he will give it to his mother. In the meantime, Zero contact from his master and then from 2 who Zero be wanting to talk again about that boy from before. Zero explains that he ended up having a small incident on his mission, but he managed to see a little more about Joshua, and Zero suspects that the boy keeps even more of a secret than they imagined, but the master claims that he never suspected suspected that the boy was special after all. The magic tower itself began to move to find Joshua. Zero was surprised and questioned why they would try to go after the boy, and then the master explained that they confused the boy with the descendant of Ancelot, and so one of the 7 magi started looking for the boy. After all, the magic tower had been looking for Ancelot for a long time. They will certainly blame the primordial stone for this. Zero still doesn't listen carefully, and the master explains that the main focus of the magic tower is no longer the primordial stone but Joshua. In this he states that he would be willing to see him in person in a card, but he cannot stop the internal conflicts of the organization. However, if the boy finds the red stone, it will change everything, so Zero is willing to find this item beforehand. Meanwhile, a man tells Vigo to shut up and just witness his fight, so he casts his magic called Rain of Lightning, killing all the ogres around, and while witnessing all this power, Vigo remains in fear, but the guy obliges him. He tells him to start talking and asks for his opinion about his magic compared to Joshua's, and when he takes the gag out of his mouth, he starts to impose himself and says that he is a nobleman from the Avalon Empire, so that guy will certainly be charged by the Empire for doing this with Vigo. This guy states that he is not afraid of the Empire, otherwise he would not have gone to that place. Having said that, he sends the noble back to talk about his magic and asks Virgo to tell him the difference between him and the rumored swordsman. Then Vigo states that in terms of power his magic is stronger than Joshua's, and even though he is a novice magician, Vigo guarantees that he is capable of feeling this, so the guy notes that the noble is telling the truth. After all, Ancelot's specialty, it wasn't the lightning attribute. That being said, he feels that he must meet this child in person, but he states that entering Agnos territory will not be easy. That's why Vigo says he's thinking in an ineffective way to find Joshua. After all, the boy went with his father to the capital, and apparently he has already been accepted into the academy, and upon hearing this, the guy becomes even more worried because having Agnos as his obstacle was already difficult. Now the academy will be even worse. Then Vigo proposes to help him with his objective, but the man finds the nobleman's goodwill strange. They had a good first impression, but Vigo states that if he wants to crush Joshua, he will gladly help him because he doesn't like that boy's excessive arrogance. The man states that this is a tempting proposal, so he asks Vigo what he can do to help, and Vigo states that the guy has the stirrup symbol under his eye, in addition to being a 6th class wizard, so he could only be Jack Stirrups, one of the great 7 wizards. In that, Jack is surprised to see a simple Viscount knowing his identity, and Vigo explains that knowledge is very powerful in Avalon. Therefore, he states that Jack will be in good hands if he joins forces with him, as Vigo has many contacts in Avalon, but Jack states that even though this work is urgent, he cannot simply join forces with an unknown Viscount, as this could lead to the revelation of his identity. Reveal Jack's identity, so he kills him anyway. After all, no one would look for a guy like Vigo, and after a few years, Josa finally signs up at the academy, and in the same year the number of noble children who also signed up went over 1,000, and there they are divided into 6 grades and only pass the year after passing a test, and to graduate from the academy they must also take a test called the graduation test. Meanwhile, Joshua plans to reach stage 5 of the spear mastery skill just like in his past life, but for now he just goes to his room, and on the way he notices the students interacting with their servants who, by the way, are only there so as not to show that the students are peasants. In that, Joshua arrives at his room and notices that the place is very spacious. Suit after all, he will share it with 2 other roommates, and speaking of which, the boy asks them not to be like the spoiled boy from the Vila's house because he wants to live peacefully now and observe the place better. Joshua notes another young man coming to this unknown boy asks him for help with his heavy luggage, and when he is helped he thanks him because he was almost dying carrying all that alone. The boy apologizes for showing up very late. He says it will be the Auguret with Douglas. Then Joshua notices that the boy is well calm. After all, he is different from those immature children who seek to display their power at all times, and after analyzing the boy, he introduces himself as Orvon Frederick, so Auguret claims that she has never heard that name before but says that they will get along very well in their first year together. In this, the other roommate goes to them and introduces himself as Icarus, and upon seeing him, Joshua recognizes him as the unlucky genius of the celestial brain. Then we are given the context of the first civil war of the princes, which in this case is a conflict that will be recorded in the history of Avalon in the future, and during it the Avalon Empire will be weakened and its king will be taken away. In this, the first and second prince, who promised to stabilize the empire, will have the bloodiest battle of their houses because the war lasted for more than 10 years, causing so an absurd amount of casualties, and finally the first prince wins the war and then takes power and authorities from the second prince. And in this war there were 2 main contributors. The first was the one who ended the civil war and became the hero of the empire, in this case the 4th prince called Caesar von Britain, and the other contributor, he was known as a genius blessed by the heavens and also by the name called the genius strategist. Furthermore, he was responsible for leading the first prince to Vittoria, and his name is Icarus the celestial brain. And the boy asks if there is something wrong with him. After all, the 2 are staring a lot, so Auguret just hugs him and says he is just surprised to have found him once again. Icarus says who didn't expect to end up in the same room as Agar, but he still says that everyone there will get along very well, and Auguret agrees with the boy's idea because it will be a very exciting year. And upon hearing this, Icarus calls him an optimist, so Joshua stays in the corner listening to the conversation. Strange fact that Icarus apparently has a friend. Then we are explained about a baron who lived in the rural harvest land of South Avalon, but he never had children until he decided to adopt Icarus, who served more as his assistant at the time, and because the boy appeared to be as a commoner, he was the target of mockery among other nobles, and as a result he always ended up being alone until one day the first prince of the Avalon Kaiser Empire came to him, and he became the first person to treat Icarus Akira says it. Human being, and in addition to giving him the opportunity to strengthen himself as much as Ikaros could in this Joshua Anna that the boy's story is similar to his. After all, he was also despised since his childhood. So he greets Ikaros and states that he must bring the boy by your side regardless of what needs to be done in the meantime. At Agnos' residence, Kane informs Lucia about Joshua having entered the academy, so she regrets not having been able to see his achievement up close, but Kane explains that if she were with him, the boy's identity would be revealed. She understands the situation and thanks Kane for always taking care of his son, but Kane says he is grateful to have gotten this opportunity. After all, he serves Joshua with great pride, and in the middle of the conversation Agnos goes to them and asks if she is feeling good there, and Lucia states that yes, she may be receiving more than necessary. In this, Agnos states that she can tell him if something is displeasing. That being said, he goes on his way. Then his servant asks why of him leaving Lucia in that residence. After all, Mrs. Vanessa can try to do something if she finds out about this, but Agnos tries to reassure him by talking about Joshua's exceptional talent, but the servant states that Babel is not an opponent to be ignored either. He suggests that Agnos decides directly who will be the head of the family to avoid these headaches. However, Agnes notes that his servant's true concern is regarding the imperial bloodline, so the servant states that if Joshua inherits the name Agnes, this will give origin to endless rumors about the family, and hearing this, Agnes decides to continue just watching a little more as far as Joshua can get, and during the first class after entering the academy, Joshua managed to discover the relationship between Agaret and Ikaros, and basically it was because these two were already famous within the academy, but of course they weren't famous for good reasons, and right after Joshua reflected on this, two students appeared asking what kind of combination that was, the illegitimate son of Douglas and a mere peasant. So the boy reveals himself as Amaru Brunstein, who keeps belittling Joshua's group. Then Joshua in his thoughts remembers that Amaru Brunstein from the Stein family was one of the 5 masters of Avalon and was referred to as the rapier master, and Joshua says that he definitely reminds Amaru with the tone of his hair and eyes stretched, and coming back, one of the boys brags that they can easily get good grades since he was in the same class as Joshua's group. Then Brun says that it was unfortunate that an illegitimate child and the peasant were failing to advance in the second year. Then Joshua deduces that the boy who was wearing a yellow tie must be in the second year, and concludes by thinking that the person's tie changes as he advances in the year, and in addition, Agaret is an illegitimate child just like him. And soon after, Brun starts to belittle the boy, saying that running away from home was more than expected for someone there, and asks if this is the life of an illegitimate son, and says he feels disgusted and ashamed for having been friends with him once, so he is questioned by another boy if he ain't being tough too much, but DeCampo asks how dare he intrude, calling him a mere peasant, and continues asking how dare he show disrespect to the Stein family, and an argument ensues and Hieros raises his voice, asking what he meant by disrespect and what he was talking about. Then Dukan says he is telling the boy to mind his own business, and any mockery directed at Amaru would make him suffer consequences, so Ikaros says he didn't say anything that would be considered disrespectful, and asks what this disrespect he is saying, but before he finishes speaking, the kid takes a punch, and in addition to hitting him, he starts insulting him, calling him a peasant who can be compared to cattle. Then Buchan says if he thinks he became a noble just because he was adopted by some baron from the countryside, and then he continues saying that the blood that flows through his veins is worse than the blood of cattle, and even says that just directing the word at him is already disrespectful, so Douglas tries to stop him, saying that he is going too far, but that only made he gets hit in the arm. Then Joshua appears very angry, slowly approaching them, so they ask who the hell the boy was, and Joshua in his thoughts says that he might break his promise to live peacefully as he had planned, but he doesn't regret it because he doesn't plan on seeing his friends being treated like cattle, and says he will completely destroy their way of thinking. But Brun looks away and shakes with fear, asking why he is here, and then Zar appears saying that he has been waiting for Joshua for a long time, and asks Joshua if he is happy to see him, and meanwhile Shin asks Muker if he is deaf, and repeats his question talking about why the 4th Imperial Prince acted as if he knew that bastard. Then Muker says that from what he heard it can be said that yes, he is no in their thoughts. Shin says he understands, but there is definitely something wrong with that boy because no matter how much he investigates he can't find anything about Viscounty Frederick, but he is still curious about how he knows the 4th Imperial Prince. Then Shin continues saying that he has nothing to do and ordering Muker to go to the moon door right now, and asks him to ask about the name that Joshua is using, and also orders his servant to find out any weakness in him no matter what. So the servant gets very apprehensive and remembers Joseph's promise, where recapitulating Joshua says that he would return the ring, but he must apologize to the Rubrica family in place of his foolish master, and he would also need to promise that he will stop Varen from doing something like that again in the name of his family's honor. So Muker tells his master that he may be meddling too much, but if he breaks his promise they won't just start despising him but the entire Marquez Vilas family. So the spoiled boy starts throwing a glass of wine at his servant, shouting at him, telling him to shut up, and asking why the promise he made on his own had to do with him. So the kid just tells him to stop talking back and do it. What does he order this while still continues verbally attacking the guy? Meanwhile Joshua and Ikaros are in his classroom when Joshua loses his thoughts, saying that his plans will attract attention to himself, but if he can get Ikaros to his side then he has no choice but to adapt his plans because people must already be curious about him thanks to Gezer. This just shows that Gezer hasn't given up on Joshua yet. After all, he keeps saying that he invited him to visit the Imperial Palace before he graduated, and Joshua says he was going to do it. This is right before he is invited because the Order of the Imperial Knights is the secret warehouse of the Imperial Palace, and Joshua says he needs to find something there while Joshua thinks he is interrupted by his teacher's scream, catching the attention of Douglas, who wakes up drooling, asking if it is time to eat, but everyone in the class starts making fun of the boy, saying that's why he approved, so the teacher calms everyone down. Then he continues the class explaining that the sword is considered the best weapon and says that there is a reason why that use a sword as their main weapon, citing Emperor Marcos and Agnos, and saying that this tells the 5 masters of Avalon. Then the teacher asks the students why the sword is considered the best weapon. So Brun says that it is simple because all weapons other than the sword are rubbish, and Joshua hears this and gets extremely pissed, and the teacher keeps saying that in war most soldiers don't use swords but a spear, and the teacher keeps asking why he thinks that and asks if soldiers need to be trained with a sword instead of a spear, and Brun just says he was talking about people with the same skill level and not disposable people like war soldiers. So Joshua just says that's hilarious because from what he's seeing the sword is absolutely the worst weapon, especially the rapier, which can't even be used with a toothpick. So everyone starts to wonder who Joshua is, and Brun gets extremely pissed at the boy, asking him to repeat himself. So the teacher asks him to stop, but Brun simply can't hold back as the Stein family uses a rapier as their main weapon and questions the teacher, saying how he can stand that disrespect, and Josa stands up calling Hilario again, saying that he belittles all weapons, it's okay, but when Josa disrespects the rapier this is disrespectful, and Brun continues shouting at Joshua saying that he just told the naked truth and challenging Joshua to fight if he wants to prove otherwise, and Joshua asks if he forgot the rule where fights between students are prohibited, but the boy continues to complain bro, and Joshua says that if he wants to fight so much they should do it in practical class the next day. So Brun agrees and asks the teacher that they use the room the next day, and the pissed off teacher thinks that it had to be that annoying kid, and then he approves saying that they can only use wooden weapons, but Brun thinks to himself that even a wooden sword will still be used to break his body, and says that it doesn't matter what relationship he has with the 4th prince, he will destroy Joshua. And right after that Douglas scolds Joshua, asking if he's crazy for talking in front of his family that the rapier is rubbish, but then Joshua asks what the problem is. Ikaros and Douglas are extremely apprehensive because he's still asking that question, and Amaru certainly won't ignore this kind of humiliation. Icarus agrees, so Joshua says he thought they were living life without thinking about anything, but he even says he can understand Agarat. So Douglas says he doesn't know how skilled he is, but Amaru is one of the most talented students at the academy since the blood of the ST family runs through his veins, and then Josa just doesn't care and says that Douglas loves him well. So Douglas explains that he, Amaru, and Amaru have been friends for a long time, and it is explained that in the Land of Death, which is on the northern border of Avalon, there were 2 families that blocked demonic beasts from invading the land without stopping. Then Amaru's father, who is considered commander of the north, is also the current head of the family. Stein and Agar's father, the head of the Douglas family, who was always by his side, helping and protecting him, and the great friendship formed by the countless number of life or death situations between them is known even among the nobles, and that was how Douglas and Agar loved they met. But as Douglas was a bastard son, it was difficult to make friends with him, however, as they both had something in common, which was the great distance from the position of heir. They were able to become friends, as they could count on each other in their childhood, so Doulas say, which is why he knows Amaru better than anyone, and why he tries to warn Joshua, so Joshua just throws it in his face because the boy wants him to apologize just for being weak, and Joshua says that if he continues like this he will live safe since he will laugh at anyone and bow down to everyone around, and at that Ikaros says that the boy is only saying this for Joshua's own sake, but he asks why he is worrying, and he says that excuses don't do anything in addition to regressing these own abilities, and if you want to change the destiny you were born with you need to push yourself to the point of almost dying, and what's more he tells you both to hold on to your own ideals if they don't want to live in someone else's shadow for the rest of his life, and then he simply leaves the room acting like a badass, leaving both of them gaping, and then Shin's servant goes to talk to Zero asking for more information about Ashvin Frederick and says that he needs information about the boy, cause the only thing he it is that he enrolled in the academy this year, and Zero starts to make an excuse, but the servant ends up falling down and says he will give him any money he asks for all the information about the boy, and Zero says he can even provide it, but the information he has is quite guy. Then servant starts to say that money is not a problem, but Zero points out that it will be too expensive because he is a person who is his organization is giving special treatment, and in this servant starts to think who this boy really is at the lunar door is giving treatment special for him, but even so the servant says he wants to know the information, and Zero asks him for 1 million gold coins, but he backs down and wonders who the hell this child is because 1 million gold coins is more than most cityish earns taxes in a year, and seeing how the servant is scared shitless he tells him to come back after a while after thinking about his decision. So Zero thinks to himself that this is an investment because as the lunar door charged 1 million coins to move with him, then they will probably think that Joshua is much more dangerous than he really is, so Varen will stop this childish revenge because the Lord Varen he knows is weak against the strong and strong against the weak, so he doesn't need to bother. All Joshua needs to do now is find the red coin for them and put an end to this long war. Meanwhile Joshua is taking advantage of the school rules because after classes they can go anywhere, so he went to the mansion that Duke prepared in order to get back the power he had lost, and while he tries to stabilize divine and demonic energy inside his body, he tries to use Bronto's power to stabilize both, but even so a huge shock ends up throwing Joshua away, which makes him simply fall unconscious, and after falling unconscious he notices that lost consciousness, and he says that this is an incomplete complete power, but it is nothing that he cannot control, so he says that if he can control a little more divine and demonic energy using Bronto, he will be able to achieve the third stage of the magic spear art, and very soon he will be able to use it again. But while he is all happy, he notices that Luca has simply disappeared, and while he is looking desperately, a voice calls him an idiot. Then the black portal appears in front of him, and in him a being of light starts saying that Joshua's stupidity has no limit because he slept for 3 days in a place where several enemies can invade at any time, and asking, who was that person who looks most like God from Hunter X Hunter? He ends up saying, who is Lucia, and tells Joshua to thank and venerate him because he was the one who was by his side protecting him during those 3 days. Then Joshua realizes that he passed out for 3 days, and in the gym there must be a huge uproar about his situation, and he remembers that anyway form when he reached the third stage of the magic spear art in the past life. He also saw that Lucia possessed intelligence in a subspace. He began to find it strange that she had evolved so much after her regression, and also strange the fact that Lucia appeared in a form of child. And when he thinks that Lucia starts to get upset about being treated like a child, then Joshua realizes that he can read his thoughts, and then he starts to brag about it being obvious that he can read thoughts in his first awakening. But he says that he has something more important than that, so he tells him to know himself before trying to know the enemy, and he asks if Joshua thinks his body is really perfect the way it is. Then he gives him information about the primordial stone, and he says that if Joshua thinks that elemental power is all it has, that's stupid, and he says that the true power of that stone is elsewhere, and he tells Josh to think about it. Even though each primordial stone has unique powers like extinction, regeneration, and harmony is not what matters, so he gives one more hint to Joshua, asking what kind of unique power the Bronto, the stone he obtained, would have. So he starts thinking about the attributes of the stones and thinks about Bronto being able to override the primordial stone. Red, that would be magma, but Lucia asks for him to think carefully because this is a question that can help him achieve success in his goals much faster. So when he talks about his goals, Josa notices and asks what he is talking about, and Lucia simply says that he is saying that he needs to take revenge. And when they arrive in the room, they see a rapiera nobleman acting very strange, but he soon moves away from them. But the other nobles start messing with the boys, and one of them, next Douglas, and he tells them ask to be left alone, but they say they can't do that, especially after their classmate left the place for 3 days right after making a scene like that. And he starts asking why he's falling on him since the culprit was Frederick, but the noble says that this is how it should be because only when they clean the place from the boys will it go back to the way it was before. And then the teacher goes to them and orders them to stop, as he had made it clear that fights between the students are banned, and in this he says it will end punishing Doken if he continues acting like this. And even when he stops the harassment, he still hits Ikaros in the face. In this, the teacher thinks it's his fault, but he still did his best to prevent that from happening, and he says he's happy that it's over at a point where he can take disciplinary action for what is happening since Frederick has disappeared. But then the boy simply arrives in the room and says he had to be absent because of personal reasons, so the teacher starts asking why he is there and asks also if he wants to dig his own grave, and everyone around him starts saying that he had the courage to come back, but it looks like he won't graduate safely, and in that case the professor just tells him to sit down and also tells the others to shut up, and he thinks to himself that now that it has reached this point he will have to do everything in his power to prevent what is going to happen. So he thinks about postponing the practical class, but while Joshua goes to his place, Amaru is already looking at him with a killer look. Then your friends ask what the hell happened, and they also talk about Frederick's family that has already collapsed, so he could just run away if he wanted. But Joshua asks if he investigated his past, but the boy says that rumors are spreading around the academy and Amaru must have him investigated, and the boy starts asking Joshua to go apologize to Amaru, and he says that bowing to people is necessary from time to time, but Joshua gets irritated that he is saying the same thing again, and he says he will show him as protecting his own convictions. But then he notices Ikaro's worried look, and he can say just from his expression, but he says that he doesn't have time to worry about that because he has something more important to do. So he remembers when Lucia said about his revenge and asks him if the spear would really have returned to the past with him, and besides that he also asks what Bronto's other ability is, but Lucia says that he must have a lot of questions, but he can't just answer like that. He says if he completes some conditions he wouldn't mind giving him some tips, but Joshua asks him to stop stalling, but Lucia gets really upset saying that he doesn't need to tell him anything, he can just shut up and go to sleep and that's it. But Joshua is the one in a hurry, and then the boy lowers his ball and Lucia likes it and says that his conditions are simple, he just needs to recover the connections he had in his past life, and also tells the boy to be more careful with him. He keeps wondering what the spear means with this, but she doesn't repeat it again, telling him to go quickly because she is getting sleepy and rushing the boy more and more in his decision that he thinks that if these are the conditions he doesn't need to think so much and accepts it immediately. And since he has accepted her conditions, he says that it is good for him to fulfill his promise because a promise with a divine artifact like him carries a special power in it, so committed he will give you the hint. And he says that the power of Bronto, as he was thinking, is not a premonition, that precognitive dream what he had was a very different power, and Josa is in doubt about what that dream of the Agnos Duchy would be because it wasn't a dream but something that happened in the future. And Lucia says that if he thinks seriously about something he is bound to appear in his dreams. In this case, one of his targets of his revenge was that guy who appeared in his dream, and to summarize, the precognitive dream he had was because of one of the dormant powers that are within him, the divine power. And Joshua gets scared, but Lucia says that, as the term suggests, divine power is the power coming from God, and a high-level priest are known for having divine revelations in days before the danger. And he says that the precognitive dream he had is something similar to this. The power of God is something much more incredible than humans they think, and in addition the second power that is running wildly through the boy's body. He says that if Joshua manages to completely absorb both of them, there will be no human capable of facing him, and to top it off he talks about the primordial stone, the true power of Bronto, which displays the power of lightning, the fastest power that has powerful destructive capabilities, and he says that this power is growth. While Joshua is thinking about it, the boy starts to make a show in the room saying that the teacher had allowed the fight between the two to happen. Then the teacher sees no way out and says that they can do the fight as promised, and Joshua says that he was already thinking about not letting it go unnoticed, as he will show him how useless the rapier is. And already in the small exercise room at the gym, everyone is watching that the two are about to face each other, and Ikaris once again asks Joshua to apologize to Amaru, but he says he won't do that. But he says that if he wins, Amaru the Stein family won't ignore this, and if their son is defeated and the rapier is humiliated, then Joshua says that he will just have to defeat them all. And this speech from the boy leaves Ikaros completely astonished, and upon noticing the boy's distrust of his abilities, Joshua decides to make a bet with Ikaros. On the case if he defeats Amaru Brunstein and survive against the Stein family, he will win the bet, and whoever loses will have to fulfill the winner's wish. But hearing this, Ikaris explains that his objective is to stop this duel. Furthermore, he states that Joshua is being very reckless because he knows what Ikaros would ask if he won the bet. However, Joshua says he didn't even think about the possibility of him losing, so Ikaros' companion tells him to leave Josa alone. After all, they can't delay the duel. But before he goes, although Ikaros tells Joshua to value himself more because he won't be able to change that place alone, and seeing these words, Joshua becomes thoughtful and feels that something has happened to Ikaros. And after that he goes to fight against Amaru, and everyone around starts to cheer for Amaru's victory, and tells Joshua he just closes his eyes and concentrates on it. Everyone around him finds the boy's attitude strange, and states that he just wants to attract attention with all this. So Joshua notices that even though he has reached the third stage of the magical art of spear, he will not need to use it to oppress Amaru. Instead, he will defeat him using only the mastery of the spear. But before carrying out his blow, Joshua reflects a little on his journey in the art of the spear, and he realizes that he has not arrived yet at the end of the road. He notices that he ended up forgetting the importance of basic fundamentals, and when he goes after Amaru, he feels that he has greater control over the situation than he had in his past life, and tells Amaru he remains irritated by suffering from Joshua's arrogance, so he states that he won't ignore something like that. But Joshua just thanks him and hits the boy with a blow, knocking him down instantly. When they witness this scene, everyone is amazed, and Anna states that the boy doesn't move as she wants, in case she were talking about Joshua. After all, the boy moves at an extreme speed and is almost invisible to the eye, making enemies unable to attack him. Joshua himself claims that he achieved the result he dreamed of and never managed to achieve in his life. Last case, he is talking about the clarification of the 6th stage of the art of the magic spear, and this was obtained only in an attack. Meanwhile, in the female dormitory, Anna did not expect to see Joshua acting so openly. After all, she thought he would remain silent, and suddenly the girl's father calls her through the magical sphere connection, and she asks if there is something happening in the kingdom. After all, he doesn't usually respond to his call so directly. He comments that there are some suspicious movements in Tron, however, is still nothing to worry about, so Anna asks the content of the conversation, and her father informs that the seed of the thunder of the 7 Magi Jack Stirrups killed Viscount Big, and how he was very useful for their disguise, and that ended up harming them. And then Anna is surprised to discover that the magic tower did something like that. After all, she can't imagine a selfish group like that doing something like that, so she deduces that the magic tower discovered their plan, and her father explains that apparently Joshua obtained an item valuable that the magic tower is. After I hear this, Anna deduces that the best strategy for them now is to get Josa. After all, he has something that the magic tower would certainly try to take from him. But her father claims that they don't need it because this is an item that the magic tower cannot use anyway, and furthermore, if attention falls on them, their plans could be annihilated. So he explains that several variables are occurring with Joshua, who, by the way, is the reason why AA made this call. She confirms that her father said and explains that Joshua has already caused problems from the moment he stepped into the gym. After all, he was challenged to a duel precisely because he was very arrogant towards the Stein family, and after that he also defeated the family's son with just a single blow. Within this matter, the father Diana is anxious to know what expression Agnos will do when he finds out what his son did, so he deduces that the title of official heir to the Agnos Duchy may end up being passed on to Joshua. But hearing this, Anna is in disbelief and states that it is unthinkable for an illegitimate son like Joshua to be able to take over the duchy in Babel's place. Her father explains that even though Joshua is an illegitimate son, he would probably prefer to pass the duchy to him rather than to someone else's son. Gets even more confused. Meanwhile, the teacher calls Joshua to talk and says that the lord of the Frederick family has been appearing for a while, and in addition, he states that he has never seen spear mastery with the boy. That being said, he asks Joshua who the boy really is, and he continues to maintain his disguise as Ashvan Frederick, and upon hearing this, the man notices that Joshua is lying, but says he doesn't care about it. After all, many high-ranking nobles enroll in the academy with false identities, but still he states that this type of rude attitude from Joshua is not welcome in the institution, because if they had just been insulting, it would not have been a problem. However, Joshua demoralized Amaru and his swordsmanship in front of all the other students. In this, Joshua states that he will take full responsibility for his actions and listen to him speak. He notes that there was another student very similar to Joshua in this case, the student called Siemens with Douglas, and when it comes to taking responsibility, he states that Joshua will not erase his mistakes just by doing this, is because even though the students at the academy are of the same rank, they still have an internal hierarchy based on the power of their families, and this hierarchical hierarchical division has already been made, and obviously Amaru is also included in it. He decides to get straight to the point, and he states that in this hierarchy Joshua is one of the weakest, so the other children will certainly come after him and bother him. If I hear this, Josa asks if he, as a teacher, thinks it is right to allow this blackmail and violence to continue happening at school. Having said that, he states that there is nothing to learn from a teacher like that. The teacher states that there are things in that world that cannot be changed, but Joshua says that only cowards think like that. The teacher explains that if Joshua is in that academy to obtain the mandatory degree, he will send him to the Order of the Imperial Knights, as there he will be able to gain his mandatory education. However, Joshua states that after being enlightened by the power of Bronto, he can no longer waste time on such things. So the teacher asks the boy what he thinks of his idea, and Joshua states that he really doesn't intend to waste his time at that gym. However, he doesn't intend to run away with his tail between his legs. That being said, he leaves the room and the teacher stays thoughtful about what he heard from the boy because he called him a coward and that moved him. And as you think more about your life, eat the gym, Joshua Anna that before leaving there he must at least destroy what is necessary to fulfill his objective. Amaru goes to him and asks to talk something, but Joshua says that they don't need to talk about anything in particular. But Amaru comes forward and apologizes to Joshua. He explains that he made fun of the spear because he was very ignorant about it and states that he is thinking a lot about everything he learned from him. In this, Joshua is in disbelief because he didn't think that Amaru was the type of person who would recognize his mistake after losing. So he notices that the boy left aside the pride of the Stein family, and realizing the boy's humility, Joshua accepts an apology him and says that he is also to blame for all this because he belittled his opponent equally in this. Amaru feels grateful that he forgave him, but Joshua claims that it was not something that could be forgiven. So Amaru asks Joshua to teach him something in case he wants to learn about that extreme speed he used during the fight. After all, using speed with size precision is very difficult in this, and uses their fight as an example, and says that before passing out he was able to feel the unpredictability of the trajectory of Joshua's attack. In this case, the trajectory of the boy's attack was not a simple straight line. Instead, Amaru felt as if his entire body was being twisted, and upon hearing this, Joshua notes that the boy felt the beginning of the rotation in that brief time of consciousness, and at the same time, analyzing that conversation as a whole, Joshua realizes that Amaru is extremely humble, as he is not ashamed to ask for soft arts teachings from those he considers stronger, and in this Amaru asks him again about Joshua's availability to teach him, and then he states who will be Amaru's teacher, but on one condition, and before hearing what would be asked, the boy gets excited and asks what the condition is, and Joshua says that he must give him some information about the academy circle he is part of and beyond. In addition, Amaru should also tell you a little more about Sims with Douglas. Meanwhile, in the Imperial Palace of Avalon, Joker warns his superior about the arrival of a letter to the Empire. Swallow. Then Marcos deduces that this letter was sent by Drax. Joker confirms the deduction from Emperor and states that Draxia plans to accelerate the progress of the previously mentioned plan, and to this end, he asks Marcos to adjust to the faster schedule and provide the support he was promised. In this, Marcos notes that the opposition made by Tranda fact worsened the situation of Draxia, so he says that there is little chance of them discovering Avalon's intervention. Therefore, Marcos states that he will not provide any military support. Instead, he proposes sending 2 masters from his empire so that Draxia will have nothing to complain about it. Joker understands his superior's decision and says he will issue this as a royal order, but he says he has other information to report. He says that Joshua enrolled at the academy with a false identity, just as they were already expecting. He apparently erased Amaru Brunstein with just a single blow. When I hear this, Marco starts laughing and says that this is something very plausible. After all, Joshua was also responsible for defeating the greatest pride of the Empire's family, which in this case would be Babel. That said, Marco states that he has a task for Joker, and he asks his subordinate to make Joshua join the Order of the Knights at any cost. And if necessary, Marcos is willing to write a letter of recommendation for the boy. And listen to this. Joker finds this strange, the Emperor's sudden decision, and notices that Marcos is really committed to bringing Joshua to his side. Meanwhile, Joshua remains thoughtful against the circle of the Araxia Academy, because in your mind this place was just a meeting point for children from the academy where they would just play silly children's games. But with Amaru's descriptions, Joshua noted that things are not quite like that. He explains that the children of high-ranking nobles make the circle a strength to be able to gather power for the future, but furthermore, the place is used to form relationships with other children of nobles, and in this, they take the opportunity to control the children of low-ranking nobles. And if they find children who are not part of this circle, they discriminate against them, and because they are very influential, even the teachers turn a blind eye to their actions. And although Joshua understands that the situation is worrying for teachers, he states that leaving things the way they are will not change anything. That being said, Joshua says that the circle's biggest victim ever appeared, so if he finds a way around this situation, it will be easier to bring Ikaros to his side. This will consequently frustrate Caesar, as he will no longer have Ikaros' support. And speaking of the boy, he goes to Joshua and informs him that Stan and the family will send someone will be there soon. But Joshua tells him to not worry about it because he has already resolved the entire situation with the affected person. But Ikaros explains that even though he has resolved things with Morrow, this does not inhibit the Stein family from interfering in this matter. After all, he ridiculed the family's swordsmanship in front of everyone, so the Stein family can act in a way that protects their reputation, and besides, the Academy Circle will get to Joshua even before the Stein family. In this, Joshua states that there is a way to resolving everything. In this case, he will only demonstrate all his power, because this way no one will go head-to-head with him. So Joshua reminds reminds Ikaros about the bet they made before, and about his desire. Joshua looks into Ikaros' eyes and asks for him at that moment. In Ikaros' mind, he doubted his own preference, but the boy asks for time to think because he needs to see if Joshua will really succeed in what he plans. His master then, Cain, states to himself that he needs to get stronger at this. Agnes asks what motivates him to get strong like this, and Cain explains that Joshua promised him that he would be his only master, so he doesn't want to disappoint him, and he also said that he would be the only one person to whom Cain would have to bow his head in this. Agnos says he recognizes Cain's desire to throw the boy away, so he sends a servant to take care of him, and in the middle of all this, Baron Red goes to Agnos and informs him that the Empire will begin to advance. That subject to this, Agnos asks for the source of this information, and Red states that this was said by the Stein family. Then he delivers a letter to the Duke where the family informs the details of the entire plan, whilst we are told a little more about the context of Swollen. In the case, this place is a great nation of the continent and Grant, and also of the Avalon Empire, and the specialty of the Swollen Empire is the arts of chivalry. Although he is a prosperous rhino, he suffers from a problem, which is the independence of the Principality of Trump, and meanwhile in the capital of Swollen, even though this go against Agnos, or against the divine knight Jean Sebastian, and upon hearing this, the Prime Minister states that Altman is forgetting that that person and Lucifer are also part of the 9 stars of the rival empire, and in addition the minister states that these issues cannot be resolved just by deleting wings. Neighboring nations, however, Altsman continues to disagree with Ganda, and when he notices him arguing in Emperor Verona, he orders them to stop and tells Alma that if he loses a fight against the enemy, the entire Swiss Empire will suffer a huge loss. So he asks the Prime Minister to share his ideas, and Gander explains that while the Avalon Empire and Rubalt Empire did not act, the other kingdoms were careful not to make erroneous moves. Therefore, at most, they will demonstrate that they are not satisfied with the situation, and this is something that the Swiss Empire can ignore, and in addition to them, the Rubalt Empire will certainly remain in theirs as well because the kingdom is in time to choose the next pope. That being said, Gondar states that they can focus their attention only on Trum. However, the Aval Empire is still one of their problems, in that Verona states that as long as Trum does not make any particular move, he will not allow them to take any reckless action. That being said, the Emperor ends the meeting there and tells Marco Verona in the comments with him that Trum's objective is that guy. So Marco confirms Verona's deduction and says that even though this person hasn't revealed himself yet, she continues to be Trum's moral pillar. In the case, the person mentioned is the knight of prominence called Uraves. Meanwhile, Agaret tells Joshua that if he messes with the Akkad circle, both he and his family will be at risk, and that he asks Joshua to listen to him just that once, but instead he states what Agaret, he's just afraid that the same thing will happen to him as happened to his brother, but Joshua says he'll stay there, and if Agaret wants to run away, he won't judge him, but he asks if the boy really wants to live just running away, and Agaret keeps knocking in the same key and says that the leader of the Araxia circle is Verona Shanvilas from one of the 12 families, so they can't do anything against the boy. And hearing this, Joshua thanks him. Thanks for informing him who the leader of the organization is, and in the meantime in the circular, Axia Natasha sends them straight to the main topic of the meeting, but Gwog says that she doesn't need to be in such a hurry, but Natasha states that he is very unconcerned about things. This must certainly worry Marquez Kobel. After all, Gwog is like that for everything, and besides that, she deduces that the Marquis doesn't even have time to worry about his own son, since he's too busy fighting against the Pontier family. In this, Gwog explains that these matters of his family have no relation to him. After all, he just wants to enjoy the moment for now. About this, Shane tells them not to argue with each other because the main point there is that Amaru was defeated by a guy called Ashvin Frederick, and upon hearing this, Natasha is already dying to see the boy because if he is handsome, she will put him in her list of suitors, and upon hearing her making jokes out of turn, Shin reprimands her and states that this boy in question has also attacked him. She has the idea of recruiting Ash into the circle, and Gu agrees with her, but Shun totally disagrees with this possibility. After all, he still intends to take revenge on the boy for the beating he received. Meanwhile, Joshua is called to speak to the head of the academy, who says he has a message in the Emperor for the boy. And when picking up the item which he received from his father, Joshua remembers the day that Agnos gave him this gift, and at the time he had told him that he got the ring from the owner of the magic tower as a reward for having helped them with this. Joshua notes that he will have to change his ways a little plans, and as for the guy in front of him, he informs that he is part of the Black Wind intelligence organization that receives orders only from the Emperor. I hear the name Black Wind. Joshua notes that he is talking about the elite supergroup that obeys all the rules imposed by the Emperor, even though it may cost their lives. Furthermore, Joshua remembers that this is the same group that an old friend known as the Assassin King was part of. The Emperor's informant states that Marcos wants Joshua to join the Order of the Imperial Knights, so he is willing to write a letter of recommendation for the boy, and if Joshua refuses to collaborate with this, Marcos states that he will cause problems for the boy by getting him expelled from the academy, consequently forcing the boy to join the Order of Knights. And after reporting what the Emperor wanted, the informant suggests that Joshua visit the Imperial Palace as soon as possible. Then the boy notices that the Emperor really has good eyes when choosing his allies. Meanwhile, Gwog fights with Ikaros, and Agaret asks the boy to control himself. After all, they no longer intend to interfere with his business, but Gwog states that they aren't understanding things yet. After all, their goal is to finish him off with Ikaros. Garrett asks what they did to him, and Gwog states that Agar's only mistake was having the wrong friend, but the boy says no. He has known Frederick long enough for him to consider him his friend, and in the middle of this argument, Shane goes to them and says that he will capture them both as hostages, and he tells Agaret to just obey, just like his older brother did in the case of him talking about Sims and listening listen your brother's name. He remembers the day when Shen purged Sims from the gym and made him lose the movement of his leg. Having done that, he tells Agaret to behave too, so he doesn't have the same fate as his brother. But the boy remembers when Joshua asked him if he was really going to continue being submissive. Then he decides to act like Joshua and hits Shun to put a stop to all this. But before reaching the Guag boy, he interrupts him, hitting him squarely. Shin explains that if Frederick tries anything against him, family of 3 will be affected. So Ikaros states that taking hostages is a cowardly attitude. After all, that's all nobles can do when they are not equals to their enemies. Therefore, he states that Shun and the other nobles do not have a bingo of dignity. And upon hearing this affront, Guag claims that mere peasants like Ikaros have no morals to talk about them. Then Shun headstow the boy and hits him with the shot and explains that that world works on the basis of the survival of the fittest. Therefore, he will use everything he has to his advantage to continue stepping on others because, as a powerful nobleman, his role is to hunt down the weakest. That being said, he continues to step on Icarus and states that if he had just obeyed his command, none of this would be happening to him. And upon noticing all the fury of the Guag boy, he advises ask him to stop beating Icaros, otherwise he will end up packing and in the middle of all this mess. Joshua shows up and says that Shin shouldn't be doing these things because they already agreed that he would keep to himself about this. Shun says that this beating, what Ikaros is taking, is still very frivolous compared to what he took from Frederick himself. So Joshua explains that stopping his friends costs a very high price, and he states that this price will be paid by Shin soon after. So the boy says that he still has influence, therefore he can end everyone's family in this. Joshua stops momentarily, and Shun feels that he managed to put the boy in his place just by using his fear to his advantage in this. Natasha notes that Frederick really is everything she expected, but Guag states that the boy still doesn't have enough power to face all the families there, and besides, Frederick isn't part of royalty, nor is he part of the 5 Duchess families, so he can't do anything about it. Natasha explains to Frederick that they have 3 of the 12 families there, therefore he would only have any authority if he belonged to the Agnos family or the Trembling Duke's family. But Shun interrupts and states that Frederick will end up there and now, therefore his family no longer matters, but before and everything. Shin asks why Frederick returned his ring. After all, he could use this object to blackmail him. Frederick states that he is not as low and pathetic as Shun, and upon hearing this, the boy says he has something to teach him. Frederick then throws a certain amount of mana into his ring, and this gives him a very great power, which for him was already enough to defeat Frederick, and he says this while wearing armor straight from a Souls-like. And if you want the continuation, does not forget, leave that comment so I can bring you more and more videos of this manual here for the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. I went.